Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're as excited tonight as I am. My reasons are, this is the last in the series of the world of Jane Austen, and so I can finally rest. But also, we have a wonderful speaker tonight, one who's been here before, who's talked about the Regency period, he's talked about De Quincey, and tonight he's going to be talking about the letters of Jane Austen. So let me tell you a couple of other things about him. His book on the Regency, called The Regency Revolution, won the prize as from The Economist. It's mentioned frequently in bibliographies. He also edited and made contributions to the Oxford Handbook of British Romantic Prose, and for Harvard University, now this is in the news, right? For Harvard University, he prepared the latest edition of Persuasion with introduction and notes. So I give you a wonderful speaker tonight, Robert Morrison.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was greatly fortunate from 2019 to 2024 to be a British Academy Global Professor at Bath Spa University. And I have to mention that because it was such a special time in my life, and my wife Carol and I got to live in Bath, and we have missed Bath. It's lovely to be back home in Ontario, Canada, to be near our boys, but we've missed Bath a lot. And we had a lovely walk around today, and it wasn't at all a mystery to me why we had missed it so much. And I have had the pleasure of speaking at Brillsey before, and I'm delighted to speak about Austen tonight. When my friend Ian at the back wrote and said, can you talk about Austen's letters? My first thought was, well, not really. I mean, I could if you wanted me to. And then when I have that response, I always think, well, I should do it because I'll learn something new. And I did learn new things. And I also had the pleasure at my home university in Ontario. Sorry if I labor the fact that I'm Canadian, but sometimes people hear this accent, they think I'm from someplace else. And I feel compelled, I'm afraid, to say that I am very proudly from Canada. So my students, I taught a course in Jane Austen, and I did what I think a lot of people that have my job do, which is I put Austen's letters on the course, because that means I have to read it and I have to teach it. And then I had these wonderfully bright 25 students, I don't know how old they were, but 25 students who asked all kinds of questions about Jane Austen's letters. And I sort of drafted the talk, and then I would go to class and I would talk about Jane Austen's letters, and then I would come home and revise it and think, oh, I should put that in. That's a good question to answer. So in addition to the joy of coming back and talking about Austen, I also get to, I learned something doing this talk on Austen's letters. So I will stop blathering and go ahead. I'm going to turn like this so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so this is called, because I wrote this to fit in with this wonderful celebration that Brillsey has organized, epistolary correspondence in the age of Austen. In Northanger Abbey, of course set the first part in Bath, Henry Tilney takes great delight in teasing Catherine Morland. He says, "It appears to me that the usual style of letter writing among women is faultless, except in three particulars: a general deficiency of subject, a total inattention to stops, and a very frequent ignorance of grammar." And yet Catherine ends up with that guy. But anyway, that's another lecture. More than a century later, in 1936, E.M. Forster found similar faults in Austen's own letters. Austen's letters didn't come out in an edition a considerable amount of time. When they did come out, Forster reviewed them, and he said, triviality, varied by touches of ill-breeding and sententiousness, characterize these letters as a whole, he complains. He doesn't stop there. She has not enough subject matter on which to exercise her powers. She takes no account of politics or religion, and none of the war, except when it brings prize money to her brothers. Her comments on literature are provincial and perfunctory. When she writes a letter, Forster concludes, she has nothing in her mind except the wish to tell her sister everything. And so she flits from the cows to the currant bushes, from the currant bushes to Mrs. Hall of Sherborne, gives Mrs. Hall a tap, and flits back again. Forster's view prevailed for several decades, but more recently, literary scholars have worked hard to reframe not simply Austen's letters, but the status of letters more broadly speaking, and letter writing has become firmly established as an important literary genre, with particularly beneficial consequences, I think, for our understanding of women writers. The image is the Oxford Handbook of British Romantic Prose that Betty mentioned, and there's a wonderful essay in that collection by a man named Thomas Richardson, who makes the point about how important letter writing is in, for example, the personal letters of women like Jane Welsh Carlyle. The personal letter, observes Thomas Richardson, captured the voice of the author, and more importantly, for those writers who did not achieve literary attention in another genre, such as Jane Welsh Carlyle or Sophia Scott Lockhart, the letter is their only enduring voice. I love that phrase, their only enduring voice. Now, Austen, of course, did achieve in another literary genre, but her letters are no longer regarded as minor or ephemeral, or as chiefly valuable because of the light they cast on her major works, that is, her 6 published novels. Her letters are in themselves the site of full-scale cultural and literary critiques with immense benefit. In her assessment of Austen's letters, for example, Vivian Jones, who edits the Oxford selection of Austen's letters, seizes on a phrase that Austen uses in a December 1808 letter to her beloved older sister, Cassandra. Austen writes, "Little matters they are, to be sure, but highly important." That's everybody's life, right? It's little to us, but it's also very important to us. Austen, observes Jones, was much more astute about the nature of her correspondence than many of her biographers and critics have been. And it's hard not to believe that Jones has Forster in mind. And a raft of other critics, many of them male. Until comparatively recently, Jones adds, Austen's letters were seen as embarrassingly preoccupied with little matters, and often dismissed as a result, and commentators signally failed to appreciate the many ways in which such day-to-day preoccupations might nevertheless be, in Austen's words, highly important. So this talk is in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about letters in Austen's age, then I'm going to talk about letters in Austen's life, and then I'm going to talk about letters in Austen's novels. When I was asked by the commissioning editor at Harvard University Press if I would edit an Austen novel, it's a good day if you've got my job, and the commissioning editor of Harvard University Press calls. There are plenty of days that aren't as good as that one. And when he called, I said, yes, I'll edit an Austen's novel if I can edit her greatest novel. And he said, I'm very sorry, Professor Morrison, but someone's already editing Pride and Prejudice. And I said, that's okay. Pride and Prejudice isn't her greatest novel. Persuasion is her greatest novel. And the reason I love Persuasion, I get so emotional thinking about this letter, we'll finish there, is Wentworth writes a letter to Anne at the end. And to me, that is everything that matters about Austen is compressed in that letter. And of course, where he writes that letter in the fictional universe of Austen, which I'm asking us all to inhabit for the course of this talk, it's not very far from here. If we ran, we could be there in 2 minutes. And so that's part of the joy of walking around Bath, right? Oh my God, Wentworth wrote that there, Right. So, okay, so I'll stop blathering. So let's talk about letters in Austen's age, epistolary correspondence, part 1. Right, I always feel this need to go right back to the beginning. So I'll just bear with me for a few moments. For centuries, mail in Britain was delivered by messengers in the employ of the monarchy or the nobility. In the 16th century, letter delivery became more organized, with dedicated post roads and a system of postboys or postmen who rode express and changed horses at intervals, but who had often to battle bad roads and bad weather, and who were also, of course, notoriously slow and even more notoriously unreliable. His famous Bath anecdote in 1794, when Austen was just 9 years old, John Palmer, a theatre manager here in Bath, and William Pitt, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, took advantage of technological advances and improvements in the state of the roads to organize the first mail coach run on the Bath-London road. Its great success prompted the establishment of other mail coach routes. A year later, William Cooper, in a famous poem called The Task, Austen's now 10, described the arrival of the mailman. And because I don't think people read Cooper enough, I'm going to read Cooper right now. He comes, that is, the mailman comes, the herald of a noisy world, with spattered boots, strapped waist, and frozen locks, news from all nations lumbering at his back. He whistles as he goes, light-hearted wretch, cold and yet cheerful, messenger of grief, perhaps to thousands, and of joy to some. To him, indifferent whether grief or joy. Houses in ashes and the fall of stalks, births, deaths, and marriages, epistles wet with tears that trickle down the writer's cheeks. By 1792, 31 major routes were served by the new mail coach system, and that number had grown to 220 by 1811, which is the year Austen published Sense and Sensibility. By 1811, ensuring that letters were distributed quickly and reliably to almost the whole of the British mainland and Ireland. I cannot give a talk without talking about Thomas de Quincey, so there's just this brief sidebar on Thomas de Quincey. But he's very interesting. None of Austen's contemporaries wrote more enthusiastically of the dramatic improvement in the mail coach service than the essayist Thomas de Quincey, who saw the mail coaches as an emblem of British efficiency, British inventiveness, and British cooperation. So in a very famous essay called The English Mail Coach from 1849, so it's 32 years after Austen died, de Quincey declares, "To my own feeling, this post office service recalled some mighty orchestra, where 1,000 instruments, all disregarding each other, and so far in danger of discord, yet all obedient as slaves to the supreme baton of the great leader, terminated in a perfection of harmony." Now, Jane Fairfax makes the same point. It's very difficult for de Quincey to make a point sort of straightforwardly. Jane Fairfax makes it rather more straightforwardly in Emma. "The post office is a wonderful establishment," she says. "The regularity and dispatch of it, if one thinks of all it has to do and all that it does so well, it is really astonishing." And really astonishing. Personal letters in Austen's era were usually charged to the recipient, not the sender. And outside the greater London area covered by the penny post were priced according to the distance traveled. Basic rates were for a single sheet of paper, 2 sheets were charged double, and so on. Between 1784 and 1812, postal rates increased 5 times. In Sense and Sensibility, published, as I say, in 1811, the penny post is already a thing of the past. The next morning brought Eleanor a letter by the 2-penny post from Lucy herself, Austen writes in that novel. Postage costs were a pressing concern. They could be avoided altogether by persuading an acquaintance who had the right to free postage, most commonly a member of Parliament, to frank your letter alongside their own. So pay for your letter alongside letters of their own. In Mansfield Park, Fanny worries that a letter she has written to her brother will be too expensive for him. But Edmund assures her that her uncle and his father, Sir Thomas Bertram MP, will frank Fanny's letter. It will cost William, that is Fanny's brother, nothing. More amusingly, I think, in Sense and Sensibility, Charlotte Palmer is not so lucky. How charming it will be when he is in Parliament, she cries of her irascible, rude husband. And Charlotte continues, but do you know, he says he will never frank for me. He declares he won't. You don't you, Mr. Palmer? So Charlotte Palmer's hoping she's going to get free letters forever. And her husband says, I'm sorry, darling, I can't help you, which is on character for him. In a letter of January 1801, I think this is splendid, but in a letter of January 1801, Austen hopes Cassandra, off to enjoy a nearby a ball in Godmersham, will not fail to benefit both yourself and me by laying out a few kisses in the purchase of a franc. So Austen teases Cassandra about trading sexual favors for some free postage. But as is so often the case in her letters, she is also commenting on a serious issue in her life, which is keeping in close epistolary contact with Cassandra comes at a significant cost. Most of Austen's letters are written on a single sheet of paper folded into four. Her writing covers all of the available space, for in a system where recipients paid, it was only polite to give them as much news, information, and diversion as possible. You were expected to fill the lot. That's good value. If you paid for a letter and you opened it up and it was only half full, you thought, I've just spent money on something that didn't deliver. So do not be angry with me for not filling my sheet, Austen closes in a 1799 letter to Cassandra, acknowledging that the space she left unused is a breach of decorum and a waste of money. Small, legible handwriting was especially admired because it was the most cost-effective. I took up your letter again to refresh me, being somewhat tired, Austen writes to Cassandra in November 1813, and was struck with the prettiness of the hand. It is really a very pretty hand now and then. So small and so neat, exclamation mark. I wish I could get as much into a sheet of paper. That is not the contents of the letter that she's commenting on. It's the sort of the ways in which the letter has been crafted and the value for money that Cassandra is delivering. And for Austen, that puts pressure on the correspondent to reply in kind. A cross-written letter, that is a letter you can see, the writing goes both ways. It goes across, and then in this image, it goes up. That's called a cross-written letter. That is a letter written with lines crossing at right angles. Was another way of saving space and cost. So you fill the whole 4 sheets like this, and then you took it and went like that and wrote the 4 sheets again. Now, in Emma, Ms. Bates apologizes for her niece, Jane Fairfax, who has sent a short letter, only 2 pages, you see, hardly 2. And in general, she fills the whole paper and crosses half. That is, she fills the whole thing, and then she crosses 2 of the 4 pages with cross writing. Typically, when one of Jane's letters arrives, Miss Bates' mother believes that Miss Bates will be put to it to make out all that checker work. Ms. Bates, however, is confident that her mother would contrive to make it out herself if she had nobody to do it for her. Every word of it. I am sure she would pore over it till she had made out every word. Now, speaking as the editor of a forthcoming edition of the Letters of Thomas de Quincey, my wife Carol and I worked with hundreds of de Quincey letters. And when we opened a file and there was a cross-written letter there, I have to say that our blood collectively froze. It is a lot. You know, you're going along thinking, oh, I'm going to get the Letters of Thomas de Quincey edited for Oxford University. And then you hit something like that and you go, oh my God, I am never going to finish the Letters of Thomas de Quincey for anyone. As Austen suggests, though, once your eye becomes accustomed to it, the contents of the letters usually do unfold themselves, although it makes a couple of pretty long days before you feel confident you've got what that letter says. You have to move, as I say here, rather painstakingly. So let's move to letters in Austen's life. The single most important fact about Austen's own letters is how many of them we do not have. That's the crushing thing. When you think about Austen's letters, the first thing that comes into your mind is that her sister Cassandra burned most of them. And she burned most of them for good reasons. But people like me want to read them. I would really like to read them, and they're gone. And if I was, maybe Cassandra did the right thing, but the world would be a very different place if we had those letters. At a conservative estimate, observed Deirdre LeFay, the editor of Jane Austen's letters, Jane Austen probably wrote about 3,000 letters during her lifetime, of which we have 160. So I'm no mathematician, but watch this. 160 letters of roughly 3,000 in total means that we have a little over 5%, which means that we are missing 95% of the letters that Austen wrote. So when anybody ever asks you about Jane Austen's letters, your first response is, bloody hell, we don't have as many of them as we might wish to have. It should be, like Coleridge's letters are in 6 volumes, Wordsworth's letters are in 9 volumes, even Keats dies at 25, his letters are in 2 volumes. De Quincey's letters are going to be in 2 or 3 volumes. Jane Austen's make up quite a thin. And there's lots of matter that goes into it, and the addition of Jane Austen's letters, I think, to sort of give it a little bit more bulk. But the actual number of letters, 160 isn't very many. Austen's niece, Caroline Austen, never saw her aunt writing novels, but she remembered that she often saw her writing letters at a desk in her drawing room. So it's a fascinating thing to think of her niece looking over and seeing Austen not writing Mansfield Park, think of Austen writing letters to family, friends, etc. What happened to so many of Austen's letters? You'll notice the blackness with which I announced that. That's what happened to them. They got burned. My students always say, well, can she do that? Yeah, of course she can. They're in the Austen family. She didn't want people like me to read them, so she burned them. Yes, she can do that. It's not illegal. Should be, but it's not illegal. Her letters to Aunt Cassandra, for they were sometimes separated, that is to say, Austen and Cassandra were usually together. So you don't write a letter if someone's in the same house, but they were occasionally separated, were, I dare say, open and confidential, Caroline Austen recollected. My aunt looked them over and burnt the greater part, as she told me 2 or 3 years before her own death. So Cassandra dies in 1845. Well, she lives 28 years after her sister Jane died, and she burned them. Cassandra, it seems, was anxious to ensure that her nieces did not read their Aunt Jane's sometimes candid, sometimes scathing comments on family members, neighbors, and passing acquaintances, especially as some of them might still be alive in the 1830s or early 1840s. Another niece, Catherine, daughter of Austen's brother Frank, agreed. Some of her Aunt Jane's letters, she remarked, triumphing over the married women of her acquaintance and rejoicing in her own freedom from care, were most amusing. Well, if that doesn't make you want them, I don't know what will. Imagine reading Austen triumphing over married women. So Devaney Lozer, one of the finest, I think, contemporary critics of Austen, offers another interpretation of why Cassandra destroyed so many letters. For she may have read, quote, the brutal treatment that critics were dishing out in reviews of the recently published letters of the late novelist Frances Burney, also, of course, very closely associated with Bath. Thomas Carlyle, the husband of Jane Welsh Carlyle, the great Scottish essayist and intellectual, wrote eloquently of the value of letters for their insights into authors, especially in his 1845 edition of Cromwell's Letters and Speeches, 1845, same year that Cassandra died. This is what Carlyle says. You know, when you're working with primary documents, it's a very special thing. When I did my edition of Persuasion, the only Austen novel where we have any manuscripts is Persuasion. There's no manuscript of Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. It's all gone. But there are 16 pages of a manuscript that belongs to Persuasion, most of it devoted to the ending that she scrapped. But it was an amazing day in my life when I got to go to the British Library and they brought out the Austen manuscript. And it's the only, I've worked with lots of manuscripts, and it's the only time that the guy stood there Like, I had to put white gloves on. And the guy, the British person who brought it out, just stood there looking over my shoulder and making sure, I don't know what, but he just stood there. And I took a long time to go through and get my own transcription. But it was amazing to think I am touching the same paper that Jane Austen touched when she wrote these pages. So this is Carlyle talking about the magical quality of working with original documents. That autograph letter, Carlyle declared, it was once all luminous as a burning beacon, every word of it a live coal in its time. It was once a piece of the general fire and light of human life, that letter. Neither is it yet entirely extinct. Well read, there is still in it light enough to exhibit its own self, nay, to diffuse a faint, authentic twilight some distance round it. By degrees, the combined small twilights may produce a kind of general feeble twilight, rendering the past credible, the ghosts of the past in some glimpses of them visible. Such is the effect of contemporary letters always. When I gave talks on De Quincey's letters, that was a sort of sustaining thing to think these haven't been read. Some of them haven't been read since I think the recipient got them. They've been buried in Greenock in Scotland. And Carol and I went there, and there's a De Quincey letter, and you think, has anybody looked at this from now till when the first person read it, if he or she even did that? It is a remarkable experience working with original documents. Cassandra's wish to protect her sister's reputation is, I think, entirely understandable. But what a loss it is not to get to read those letters. Caroline Austen tries to console us. There is nothing in those letters which I have seen that would be acceptable to the public, she asserts. They were very well expressed, and they must have been very interesting to those who received them, but they detailed chiefly home and family events, and she seldom committed herself even to an opinion, so that to strangers they could be no transcript of her mind. I don't believe Caroline Austen. I want to see them, Caroline. You may not think there's anything in them, but I would like to read for myself, and I would like to judge for myself, and I think I would find that there was plenty in them that illuminated all kinds of different aspects of early 19th century life and Austen's novels. The small number of letters we do have tell us a remarkable amount about what was highly important to Austen in both her personal and her professional life. Austen's extant letters cover a period of just over 2 decades, from 1796, she's 21, around at the end of the year, until 1817 when she died, July 1817. During these years, she changed, as Vivian Jones puts it, from a young woman critically but fully engaged in the maneuverings of the local marriage market to a mature individual content with her unmarried status. Austen's letters give details of her social life, including when she was 21 and flirting at a ball, as we all know, with Tom Lefroy. This is what Austen writes to Cassandra. Most of the letters are to Cassandra. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together, she tells Cassandra, before adding, he is a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you. Letter writing, however, was also one of women's central domestic duties. And in April 1798, with Cassandra away from home, Jane, as the second Austen daughter, was tasked with writing a formal letter of condolence to her dear cousin, Philadelphia, Walter. You can hear the change in tone. The loss of so kind and affectionate a parent, Austen writes, must be a very severe affliction to all his children, to yourself more especially, as your constant residence with him has given you so much the more constant and intimate knowledge of his virtues. Austen in her letters discusses her role in family life in Steventon, where she grew up. I am very grand indeed, she tells Cassandra in October 1798. I had the dignity of dropping out my mother's laudanum last night. Laudanum is, of course, opium diluted in alcohol. I carry about the keys of the wine and closet, and twice since I began this letter have had orders to give in the kitchen. Our dinner was very good yesterday, and the chicken boiled perfectly tender. Good. That's good, right? That should make you happy. I'm so glad Jane got perfectly boiled chicken. In 1801, Austen writes to Cassandra with a breathless account of the family's preparations for their move to Bath. My father and mother, wisely aware of the difficulty of finding in all Bath such a bed as their own, have resolved on taking it with them. Austen writes again to Cassandra, all the beds indeed that we shall want are to be removed, namely, besides theirs, our own two, the best for a spare one, and two for servants. It was a big deal when they moved to Bath. From Green Park Buildings, of course, just down here. In January 1805, Austen writes another and far more difficult letter of condolence, this time to her brother Frank. I have melancholy news to relate and sincerely feel for your feelings under the shock of it, she tells him. Our dear father has closed his virtuous and happy life in a death almost as free from suffering as his children could have wished. Frank is, of course, as we know, in the Navy and away from home. Once settled in Chawton in 1809, Austen prepares to launch her career as a writer. In April 1811, she assures Cassandra, I am never too busy to think of sense and sensibility. I can no more forget it than a mother can forget her sucking child. And I am much obliged to you for your inquiries. I have had 2 sheets to correct. She's getting proofs. But the last 2 only bring us to Willoughby's first appearance. Pride and Prejudice appeared, as we know, on January 29th, 1813. Famously, Austen wrote to Cassandra to say that it was rather too light and bright and sparkling. So one of the things that happens in her letters, and it's interesting that these are some of the ones that Cassandra saved, or when Austen is talking about her own writing. And this is what Austen said about Pride and Prejudice, right? You know, it's difficult, right? She doesn't like what she's done in Pride and Prejudice. And you really do want to say to her, Jane, it came out okay. I think you'll find that people were quite, 200 years later, people were pretty happy with it. But Austen said it wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense, if it could be had, if not of solemn, specious nonsense about something unconnected with the story. An essay on writing, a critique of Walter Scott pictured there, or the history of Bonaparte, or anything that would form a contrast. She's fretting it's too much like a fairy tale, which of course it might be called. Lots of critics have called Pride and Prejudice a fairy tale. There's no way Darcy's going to marry someone that far down the social scale. That's not going to happen. It's a fairy tale. It's also a biting piece of social realism. And ask yourself how Austen makes a fairy tale go together with biting social realism. That's part of, I think, what makes her so interesting. Austen's letters also contain several other comments on her novels. To her niece Anna, an aspiring novelist, in September 1814. This is one of the most famous quotes out of the letters. You are now collecting your people delightfully, getting them exactly into such a spot as is the delight of my life. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. That's been seized upon over and over and over again. So this one has done more damage in my view. To another aspiring writer, her nephew, James Edward Austen, Austen gave a far more misleading assessment of her novels, I think. What should I do, she writes to James Edward, with your strong, manly, spirited sketches full of variety and glow? How could I possibly join them on to the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor? That got seized upon for about a century and a half so that people could say, she's very small, she's very domestic, there's no broad canvas, there's no talk of war, there's no talk of the contemporary events. It's all about boy meets girl, and Austen is a domestic novelist. And this is, I think people would now agree, a terrible, terrible reduction. But when the author herself says it, you've got a bit of a problem. I think she's just trying to be nice to James Edward, and that she knows. Virginia Woolf, when she read Austen knew what was happening in Austen. Virginia Woolf says she's the mistress of much deeper emotion than appear on the surface. I think that takes us closer to Austen. Read Virginia Woolf on everything. Virginia Woolf talks about wallpaper. Read Virginia Woolf. She's so smart. Austen, in her letters, is often called upon to give advice, especially on topics that preoccupy in her novels, including money, romance, and female independence. The unpleasantness of appearing fickle is certainly great. She counsels her niece Fanny Knight in a letter of 1814. But if you think you want punishment for past illusions, there it is. And nothing can be compared to the misery of being bound without love. Bound to one, preferring another. That'd be pretty awful. Bound to one and preferring another. However, in another letter to Fanny, Austen acknowledges the perils of remaining unmarried, either by choice or otherwise. Single women, she tells Fanny frankly, have a dreadful propensity for being poor, which is one very strong argument in favor of matrimony. Now, if we had 95% more letters than we do, there might be plenty of comments that tell us things like single women have a propensity for being poor. In late 1815, Austen published Emma, which she reluctantly, very reluctantly, dedicated to the Prince Regent. She did not like him, understandably. Nearly 3 years earlier, in a letter to her close friend Martha Lloyd, she had made it clear how much she despised the Prince Regent. I suppose all the world is sitting in judgment upon the Princess of Wales' letter to her estranged husband, Austen remarks. Poor woman. I shall support her as long as I can because she is a woman and because I hate her husband. Again, I wish we had those letters. I'll stop saying that. A few months after Emma appeared, the Prince Regent's librarian, James Stanley Clark, suggested to Austen that she write a historical romance founded on the House of Saxe-Coburg. And here is Austen's reply to that idea. I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life, she told Clark. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I am sure I should be hung before I had finished the first chapter. To me, this is an example of someone saying, why don't you do this? This would be good. What is it? And Austen knows what she's good at. And Austen says, to the Prince Regent's friend, I'm not doing that. I'm not even going to start doing that. That's not what I do. I think she's very good to rebuff him, especially with humor. One of the most remarkable features of Austen's letter writing is the number of times she speaks insightfully about letter writing. She's very self-conscious of it in a way that helps establish letter writing as a genre, I think. To Cassandra in 1801, I have now attained the true art of letter writing, which we are always told is to express on paper exactly what one would say to the same person by word of mouth. I have been talking to you almost as fast as I could write the whole of this letter. In July 1808, she writes to Cassandra of both the demands and the pleasures of keeping up an epistolary correspondence. When I taught this to my students, they were like, what, people used to sit down and write letter? What's that about? They say texting away, texting away, texting away. And I said at one point, how many people in this room have sat down, written a letter on paper and posted it? 0 out of 23. None. They're all born, they're born like 2005, 2000, and, they don't know about that. And I said there was a real joy to getting a letter and opening up. And they looked at me like, how old are you? Like, man, how old are you? Right? And I said, it's just after, Napoleon was defeated by Wellington. That's when I was born. Okay. Keeping up epistolary correspondence. I assure you, this is Jane talking, I assure you, I am as tired of writing long letters as you can be. What a pity one should still be so fond of receiving them. Austen often compares her letters to those of other family members and finds her own wanting. This is one of my favorites. To her brother Frank in September 1813, you write so even so clear, both in style and penmanship, so much to the point, and gives so much intelligence that it is enough to kill one. Right? In other words, I've got to write something back to you as good as you've just sent to me. That's enough to kill me. I can't be as clear and as even in style and penmanship, etc., etc. Only a few months before her death, Austen wrote to her niece Fanny Knight to thank her for the gift of a beautiful letter. You can see their cultural importance, even in the ones that we do have. As to making any, Austen is unwell, but she writes, as to making any adequate return for such a letter as yours, my dearest Fanny, it is absolutely impossible. If I were to labor at it all the rest of my life and live to the age of Methuselah, I could never accomplish anything so long and so perfect. The following month, Austen began to put her affairs in order. I, Jane Austen of the parish of Chawton, do, by this last will and testament, give and bequeath to my dearest sister Cassandra Elizabeth everything of which I may die possessed, or which may be hereafter due to me. Epistolary correspondence in the age of Austen, letters in Austen's novels. This is the third and final section. In Mansfield Park, Austen notes that a large proportion of the female world is addicted to letter writing without having much to say. In her novels, though, both women and men write large numbers of letters, and often, I think, with a very great deal to say. In Northanger Abbey, James Morland writes to his sister Catherine to tell her that his engagement to Isabella Thorpe is over. Her duplicity hurts me more than all. Till the very last, if I reasoned with her, she declared herself as much attached to me as ever. And we all know that's not true. When Isabella seeks to reconcile with James, she writes a letter to Catherine asking for help. I am quite uneasy about your dear brother, not having heard from him since he went to Oxford, and am fearful of some misunderstanding, she tells Catherine. Your kind offices will set all right. He is the only man I ever did or could love, and I trust you will convince him of it. Same paragraph. The spring fashions are partly down. Right? She didn't even have the dignity to start a new paragraph. It's just all one schmoz. The letter helps Catherine to see much more clearly. Its inconsistencies, contradictions, and falsehoods struck her from the very first. She was ashamed of Isabella and ashamed of having ever loved her. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne arrives in London and immediately writes to Willoughby, who fails to respond. Has no letter been left here for me since we went out? She asks the footman, who answers her in the negative. Are you certain that no servant, no porter, has left any letter or note? Of course, we're certain. When a letter from Willoughby finally does arrive, it is devastating in its impudent denial that only a few months earlier he had felt a powerful attachment to Marianne. This is what he writes, unpleasant person that he is. I mean, he says later it was dictated to him, but if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt or meant to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of esteem. And when I came behind you and cut that lock of hair off your neck, that's what guys do all the time. That didn't mean anything, etc., etc. That I should ever have meant more, you will allow to be impossible when you understand that my affections have been long engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled, which of course it is. Letters are so common in Pride and Prejudice that many commentators have assumed that when Austen first completed it in the late 1790s, it was an epistolary novel. Darcy writes a long letter to his sister Georgiana with Caroline Bingley sitting beside him, praising his handwriting and the evenness of his lines. Caroline praises virtually everything that she sees in Mr. Darcy. How many letters she must have occasion to write in the course of a year. Letters of business too, she exclaims. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. Throughout, of course, Mr. Darcy is trying to ignore her. Elizabeth receives a painful letter from Jane after Caroline Bingley finally pays her a visit. My dearest Lizzie will, I am sure, be incapable of triumphing in her better judgment at my expense, when I confess myself to have been entirely deceived in Miss Bingley's regard for me, Jane declares. After rejecting Darcy's first proposal of marriage, Elizabeth on the following morning seeks air and exercise by taking her favorite walk, where she unexpectedly encounters Mr. Darcy. I have been walking in the grove some time in the hope of meeting you, he tells her. Will you do the honor of reading that letter? And Elizabeth sits down and reads it, and she soon knows that letter by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings towards its writer were at times wildly different. After Lydia runs off with Wickham, she sends a letter to Colonel Foster's wife, Harriet. Just, you can note the range Austen has as the letter writer, from Darcy's letter to Isabella's letter to this is Lydia. And Austen sort of becomes Lydia to deliver this. You will laugh when you know where I am gone, Lydia tells her, and I cannot help laughing myself. I am going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton. For there is but one man in the world I love, and he is an angel. Lydia, I have news. Willoughby is not an angel. Oh, thoughtless Lydia, Elizabeth cries. What a letter is this to be written at such a moment. But at least it shows that she was serious in the object of her journey. Whatever he might afterwards persuade her to, it was not on her side a scheme of infamy. In Emma, Austen makes especially clear the central role of letters in the Regency culture. They are a source of gossip. I suppose you have heard of the handsome letter Mr. Frank Churchill has written to Mrs. Weston Natter, the good people of Highbury. I understand it was a very handsome letter indeed. Mr. Woodhouse told me of it. Mr. Woodhouse saw the letter, and he says he never saw such a handsome letter in his life. Letters reveal character. This is Mr. Knightley not being happy. Frank Churchill can sit down and write a fine, flourishing letter full of professions and falsehood, Mr. Knightley informs Emma, and persuade himself that he has hit upon the very best method in the world of preserving peace at home and preventing his father's having any right to complain. His letters disgust me. Right. Well, Mr. Knightley doesn't like Frank Churchill, I guess. The constant flow of letters, both of business and of friendship, are regarded by some as irksome. Knightley's brother John tells Jane Fairfax that letters are never worth going through the rain to pick up, adding that he views them generally as a very positive curse. But this is what Jane Fairfax writes or says to him in response. But Jane Fairfax's circumstances are very different than John Knightley's, and letters connect her to the world and to those that she loves, to whom she loves. You have everybody dearest to you always at hand. I probably never shall again, Jane tells him. And therefore, till I have outlived all my affections, a post office, I think, must always have power to draw me out in worse weather than today. To Persuasion belongs the most powerful letter, I think, in all of Austen. Wentworth to Anne as the novel draws to a close. This is my edition of Austen's Persuasion, and that's Henry Raeburn's portrait. No, that's not Henry Raeburn, of course. That's Henry Raeburn's portrait of Marguerite. But what is it, Marguerite? Double-barreled name. Oh, Scott Moncrief. More than 7 years, as we all know, before the action of Persuasion begins, Anne agrees to marry the dashing naval commander Frederick Wentworth. But her father and her close friend Lady Russell disapprove of the match, and Anne is persuaded to end the engagement. The decision breaks both her heart and Wentworth's. Then, after a highly successful naval career, Wentworth returns to England, now a captain and a wealthy man. He's made a lot of money, made a lot of prize money, and it's in Bath that he and Anne really rekindle. It starts earlier, but he and Anne really rekindle their romance here. The two of them are in a room at the White Hart Inn in Bath in this closing scene. Wentworth is sitting at a desk writing a letter. Anne is nearby speaking to a mutual friend, Captain Harville, about men and women and constancy. And she says, "We certainly do not forget you as soon as you forget us," Anne tells Harville, as 8 long years of pent-up anguish over Wentworth flood out of her. "It is perhaps our fate rather than our merit. We cannot help ourselves. We live at home, quiet, confined, and our feelings prey upon us." I think it's almost indisputable. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's very likely that Lord Byron read Persuasion. And you'll remember at the end of Canto 1, Donna Julia writes a letter in which she says to John Jewett effectively what Anne says in this letter. Wentworth, still writing his letter, overhears Anne's comments, and he knows immediately that she is speaking about their relationship and about all that has been lost. So this is Austen building this scene. They're not talking to one another. He's listening to her and she's writing to him. And the tension that creates when they're not speaking is, Austen finishes it. I don't know if you've read the original ending of Persuasion, but it's quite flat. It sort of ends in a kind of uneventful, they got together way. And I think she reads it to Cassandra, and Cassandra goes, it's okay, but you should try again. And Austen goes, bloody hell, I'll try again. And she's a sick woman. She sits down, she writes this. It is an example, I think, of sometimes you think, well, first thought, best thought. You know, Wordsworth revises, and you think, really? I think it was better the first time. Whereas when Austen revises the ending to Persuasion, I think it's spectacularly better in the revision, which is not always what happens. Seizing another sheet of paper, he begins a second letter in which he records his feelings toward her as she utters hers towards him. He leaves the letter behind on the desk for her to read. If Wentworth loves Anne, she has a future that stretches as far as the seas. If he does not, she has only a past that I think will increasingly consume her. And at this point you go, oh, thank God I'm in an Austen novel. If I was in a Hemingway novel, this would end in blood and disaster. But I'm in an Austen novel. I can relax. They have been at odds, but don't worry. Austen knew that love is the very largest concern of life, then as now. And in Persuasion, she makes Anne's whole world hang on a single letter. It is a moment that demonstrates, I think, both the superb compression and the enduring appeal of her art. My record of reading this letter is pretty shaky, but I'm going to try. You pierce my soul. This is what Wentworth writes, not speaks, writes to Anne. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8.5 years ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Sometimes my students think that if you want to read a passionate novel, you should read Wuthering Heights. That's a novel about passion. And I say to them that I think you should reread Persuasion, because that, to me, is more passionate than anything in Wuthering Heights to me. Right, it is the final letter in Austen's final novel. And among many other things, a fitting tribute to the key role letters played in Austen's age, Austen's life, and especially, I think, in Austen's novels. I got the pictures there and information from those people, Deirdre Fay and Janet Todd and Vivian Jones, and the images came from there. I always feel like I want to give credit to the archives and things. And that's my talk. Thank you very much. I have to say that I probably could have been a little less wobbly if I wasn't jet lagged. That's what I'm going to brighten up. I'm a little tired. Canada's a long way away.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't mention your affiliation
No,
with
no, it's
Bath
just Bath
because
Spa.
that is where we found him
Yeah.
and had him for several years, but he's now returned to Canada. But it was lovely having you back tonight, and what a performance! Thank you very much. Right now, any questions for our speaker tonight? Right? Are you afraid of tears?
I don't think, I'm not sure that it's, is that,
Can I just say thank you so much? That was absolutely amazing, jet lag or whatever, but it was fabulous talk. Really, really, really good.
thank you very much.
And Persuasion's my favourite one too. I suddenly thought, perhaps Jane decided to stay single because she did not then have to show her letters to her husband. Because it made me think about Elizabeth Gaskell. Whenever she wrote letters, her husband read the letters she received and read the letters that she wrote. William Gaskell, the vicar. And then going on from Elizabeth Gaskell, I was thinking of wondering, why do you think Charlotte Bronte didn't get Jane Austen?
So, it's a question about Charlotte Bronte?
I wanted to just share about the letters.
Right.
Then I was just telling you about Elizabeth Gaskell because I think it's very interesting.
It is.
And then, of course, Elizabeth Gaskell wrote that biography of Charlotte Bronte.
Yes.
And we know that, obviously, Virginia Woolf got Austen, and for example, George Henry Lewis, because he's the one that converts.
Yeah.
But I've always wondered, and as you're an expert, what was your opinion about why Charlotte Bronte didn't get Jane Austen?
Can I just say first about Elizabeth Gaskell thing? I think, as different quotations in the talk suggested, Austen really didn't want to be married. When she talks about sensibility being, I'm as conscious of this as a mother is of a sucking child, that's not the first time she likens her novelistic art to motherhood. And I think Austen looked around at the fate of women and went, bloody hell, I'm not doing that. I want to be a writer. And if I get married, I'm going to have to not do that. And I think, thankfully, that she committed herself to a life of, a professional life of creativity and art, and didn't marry. And maybe one of the reasons was because she thought, I don't want anybody reading the letters that I don't want a husband lording over me who says, let me read those letters. I don't think that would go down well with her, which is one of the reasons that we liked her so much. When the librarian writes and says, what about a historical romance in the house of Saxe-Coburg? And she says, I'd rather hang myself, in effect. I think that's great. I think my edition of Persuasion starts with the famous quotation from Charlotte Bronte to Lewis, in which she says, what are you so excited about Austen? It's like this perfectly trimmed little garden, and there's no Bonnie Beck, there's no hills, no nothing. And I think that Charlotte Bronte regarded Austen as a bit airless, as a bit confined, as a bit indoors, a bit teacuppy, and like that. And she wanted, roaming on the heaths and a more demonstratively passionate set of characters. But for me, the fact that Austen's characters have to operate within this very restrictive code, or often restrictive code, especially women, of decorum and manners and tradition and hierarchy and things like that, and that they're boiling with passion all the same, makes it more intense. The fact that they don't speak to one another is, to me, more moving than, Heathcliff yelling at Cathy for the, you are a ghost, you're going to haunt me forever, I am Heathcliff, Nellie, blah, blah, all that. To me, the fact that that Bronte doesn't like her because I think she wants a more open, demonstrative show of passion. I think there's plenty of passion in Austen. It's just buttoned down in some instances. But Wentworth says his heart there. Darcy says his heart, I think. Virginia Woolf knew. That's what I think.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastically wonderful talk.
Right.
My question...
I was fretting about it on the plane. I'm so glad.
No, don't fret.
All right, I won't fret.
My question is very prosaic and practical.
Good, I like those questions.
You started illustrating the male coaches.
Yeah.
And in Persuasion,
Yeah.
Anne Elliot does actually say, she receives a letter and she says, she finds out that Berwick has brought it, but she hadn't been able to trace the last few steps. So presumably there was no postman going door to door. How, once the male coaches had come in, then what happened? Do you know? The letters would have gone to the post office? Did you have to go and collect them like Jane Fairfax did?
I think, the answer is I don't know, but in some senses, different things happened in different places. Do you know?
No, I don't, but I'm raising my hand because I'm assuming they went to top, because everything went to top.
That's where I'm going very soon. So yes, I think often that the male coach pulled up, like in De Quincey, the male coach pulls up and people gather around. In De Quincey's essay, they gather around because they want to know the news. What's happened? Has Britain won a major victory in the war against Napoleon, for example, in De Quincey's essay? And so it's easy to believe in some occasions that the male coach pulled up and sort of the village came out and got, but I would say that in different places, different things happened. So some places, like a built-up urban area, it's conceivable, I think, that people would have gone door to door to door to door. Whereas in a village, the mail coach didn't stop for very long. In some cases, a minute or 2 minutes. If they didn't have to change horses, a minute or... So I think people would come to the coach. But it was a sort of a major event in the day when the mail arrived, or when the mail coach pulled up, especially as it became more regular and more. But I don't know exactly how, once the coach arrived, how the letters were actually distributed. But if I had to guess, Cooper's poem makes it pretty plain that someone's walking. But in other instances, I imagine time and money, like now, determines how you get your mail or whether you have to walk to get it. I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer, but I'm afraid I don't exactly know. You see, the prosaic questions are always the good ones, right? How did that happen? I don't know.
It was a joy to hear a fully formed lecture with complete sentences and beginnings and ends, and not a rambling podcast or something.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
My question,
I wish I'd spoken to you before I got on the plane. I would have had a better trip.
my question is Jane Austen the first author to write about women's lack of agency in her class? Or were there others Fanny Burney or others who wrote about the lack of choice and the lack of ability to earn money, like that quote in Sense and Sensibility about, I can't earn a living, I can't work.
Yeah. Well, Jane Austen, it seems to me, marks a turning point. There are very, very fine 18th century women novelists. Frances Burney, most obviously, is someone that, she quotes two of Burney's novels in that famous passage at the end of chapter 4 of Northanger Abbey, where she says, it's only a novel, it's only, something where the greatest thoughts of the finest minds are expressed, or something to that effect. So Austen is conscious of Frances Burney, and there are other, Sarah Fielding, for example, who are very fine novelists. But the world does start to change at the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the things that starts to change is that you can make your living as a writer. So, for example, there's a man named Robert Southey who wrote for the Quarterly Review from Keswick. And for the first time, patronage is not necessary. Southey can sit there in Keswick, in the lakes, write for the Quarterly Review and make a pretty good living. That is, capitalism and technology and advances in printing mean that you can become a professional writer that is getting paid for your literary labors in a way that wasn't possible, or not possible to the same extent. You know, there were major periodicals in the 18th century, but the one that changed everything really is the Edinburgh Review in 1802, and that means you can make your living. And Austen lives in that age, so she is delighted when she gets paid for her literary labors. And I think, to sort of come back to the first question, part of it is just the joy of being independent, you know, of making your own money. And she's living in a house on an estate that her brother has inherited, and she's not as independent. You can tell when someone tells her what to do, even if it's the Prince Regent's librarian, she writes back and says, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that, right? You can sense that very strong independent streak in her. And the fact that in her age, in her era, it was possible to write and make money for women as well as men. I mean, obviously men, there's always like that, but women had a chance in Austen's age. And the fact that the Prince Regent liked her novels helped. I mean, she bit her lip, but she still dedicated Emma to him because he had a copy in each of his houses. And the fact that, there's plenty wrong with that guy, with the Prince Regent, but I've got a soft spot for a tiny part of him because he said, I want Austen novels in all my houses, right? So you ask yourself, how bad can a guy be? Well, he's pretty bad, and his attitude toward women is pretty appalling. But, it's like, I've got a very dear friend who dated a woman for 2 years because he met her at a Neil Young concert. Not to promote too much Canadiana, but he met her at a Neil Young concert and he said, she can't be that bad. She was at a Neil Young concert, right? So he went for 2 years. I mean, okay, so now I'm on my friend Roy. But the notion that Austen could make a living and could attain a degree of independence is pretty significant. And she is, I would say, the first major female novelist to encounter that dynamic in the marketplace. Is that answered? Absolutely. Does it? Okay.
Hi, I just want to ask a question.
Well, just a minute. Oh, there you are.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm here.
That's okay. Sorry. It's dark out there.
Thank you so much for that really enlightening talk. And it made me think differently about Austen's narrative style for the first time. You talked about in her redrafts and revisions, she improves her narrative style. And when you talked about her first edition of Pride and Prejudice being an epistolary novel,
yes,
I wondered to what extent do you think her letter writing actually contributed to her free and direct discourse sort of narrative style by getting into the minds of the characters, and actually does letter writing play a big part in that new way of writing? If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So when I said about Austen's manuscripts, we only have those 16 pages from her novel, and we've got different manuscripts of her letters, of course. So, I mean, one of the hard things is it would be, the world would be a different place if someone opened at a British Rail boot sale and pulled out the manuscript of Pride and Prejudice. And we could see, I mean, I've worked a lot with manuscripts. It's not what's in the letter, it's what he crossed out. The first time he says, what a bastard. And then he crosses it out and says, I'm not fond of this gentleman, right? And you think, well, the real interest is in what he crossed. That's a spurious example, by the way. The real interest is what he crossed out. And in his famous works, it's what he crosses out that's so interesting, because you can tell when he doesn't want Wordsworth to know. He crosses it out like that, right? But there are different ways of crossing it out, right? And you can cross it out by just a very thin little line where you can see exactly what he wrote. Here was my first thought, Mr. Wordsworth. I'm crossing it out and putting it more nicely, but there's what I'm actually thinking or feeling, or why I behave in the way that I did. So part of what I was trying to bring up in the talk was the way in which Austen as a letter writer and Austen as a novelist who has letters in her novel, there's a good deal of confluence between the two of them, and Austen has many different styles of letters, and Austen's got many different techniques, but when you think that she probably wrote, if Deirdre Lefay is right, 3,000 letters, she published 6 novels, she wrote 3,000 letters. I think it's pretty difficult to think that writing those letters didn't in some way influence the way she communicated in a novel. And free indirect discourse, I think, could be, as you're suggesting, a product of having not her main voice is her novel, but she has another voice for her letters, which is what makes them, I mean, when my students read them, they were like, my God, she's much sharper in her letters than she is in her novels. There's a way in which letter writing brings out of Austen things that aren't permissible or aren't available or whatever in her novels. So yes, I do think that the letter writing fostered all kinds of different styles and techniques in her novels. Yeah? Yeah.
Ian Gadd has been monitoring questions from our Zoom audience. Ian, anything?
Yes, lots of praise, first of all, and actually a particular comment that. So there are a couple of questions. I'll give them to you all together, so you can then respond to them in sequence. But a lot of comment about people who cherish letters and how important letters have been in their lives, and so. Yeah. There were 2 questions that I'll combine because they're on a similar point, which was, the first one was why did recipients keep the letters? And the second question linked to that were letters intended to be shared and read aloud at that time? I hadn't realized that Cansada had kept Jane's letters for 25 years before destroying them. I wonder if the family read or reread those in the intervening years. So that about why keeping and how letters were handled. And then another one, which is a more focused question about the letters that Jane wrote in Bath after her father died. Did she write about the poverty that was facing them? So those are the two types of questions that came through.
So, okay, to my slightly jet-lagged mind, I'm going to try to get the first one, which is letters were absolutely passed around. Letters were absolutely read aloud to the family. They were reread. You know, a couple of quotations I used reveal the extent to which you read it, and then you reread it. That's why when someone writes you a letter, you pay the full whack and you only get 2 sides, you complain. It is a way, it is, you know, you didn't pick up the phone, you didn't text, you didn't drive down the road. That was the way, the primary way of communicating with someone who was, the only way of communicating with someone who was far away. And so there's definitely a sort of performative act about them. Sometimes you read a letter and it's, you know, don't show this to anyone. But oftentimes, Austen, it's a performance for the family. And so it's read aloud and people gather around and it's passed around. So there are plenty of times when Austen refers to a letter that wasn't written to her, but that someone has passed to her to say, here's what's going on in, you know, this person's life. And Austen gets to make that a part of her mental landscape. So there's a real sense in which it was performance. And there are some people, you know, who saved and preserved that. I mean, the fact that Cassandra's got so many letters at the end tells you, I think, that this is an author that her family believed some people were going to have an interest in, or that maybe you saved them because Jane is gone, but that's a way of preserving your memory of her or your interaction with her, or it's a way of, you know, it's what Tom Richardson said, you know, that's the authentic voice. It's her enduring voice. And so, you know, the fact that families kept them a long time. There are also authors who thought, you should absolutely save my letters because someone's going to come along and want to read them. Do you have any idea how important I am? Right? Like that. So there were people who saved them, you know, I think because it was a way of retaining contact with people, whether they were there still or whether they weren't. And when they leave early, as Austen tragically did, you can understand why her sister would want to hold on to them. It was a performance, you know, it was gone now, but it was a performance.
And
Second question.
yes, that did Jane write anything about her time in poverty after in Bath after her father died?
The answer to that is almost certainly she did. You know, when George Austen dies, that's a problem. The man has died, that's a problem. And so they spend, I mean, Austen finished, well, she wrote Sense and Sensibility, probably 1795-ish, probably an epistolary novel. She finishes Pride and Prejudice 1798, same year as Lyrical Ballads. Then she finishes a novel called Susan, which becomes Northanger Abbey. Right? And someone says, yes, I'll take it, and then they don't publish it. So there's this weird irony of Austen's publishing history, which is the first novel she completed is the last one to come out. It's published posthumously with Persuasion. The two Bath novels, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, end up together in, well, it's published in December 1817, but the title page says 1818. That sense in which, just a minute, I've lost it. What's the question? Come back to me.
About poverty, about what happens after he died.
Right. So I know what I'm doing. Kind of. So Susan is finished in 1800, 1801, something like that. Austen doesn't publish for 10 years. When she comes to Bath, she writes something in manuscript called The Watsons, which is pretty, I mean, I quite like it, but it's quite sour. It's quite disaffected. Nothing happens in Bath, she writes letters. And then even 5 years after Bath, 1806 to 1811, she doesn't really get centered again until 1809 when she gets more stability, when she moves to Chawton. So I think among the first letters to go, if Cassandra was going through them, was Austen's unhappiness about being in Bath, about losing her father, and about declining into poverty. Those years, 1805, 6, 7, 8, before Edward steps in and offers her a place, offers her and Cassandra and Mrs. Austen a place, you know, why did he take so long to do that? Why has he got them shifting about in Southampton and things? I don't know. But once things settle down in 1809, then Austen says, right, now I'm going to become an author. So I think she almost certainly wrote about it, and I think they would have been the first into the fire when Cassandra, you know, that's the family's unhappiness. I think Cassandra would have burned them.
Well,
Right.
thank you so much. And what a splendid ending to our World of Jane Austen series. And could we please all thank our speaker, Rob Morrison.
Thank you.